Hi, I'm Wes Allen, and today I'm going to be talking about a new entry into the OSR community. This is my look at Chromatic Dungeons. Let's roll it. At the time I'm recording this, Chromatic Dungeons is not yet out for general release for a print edition, so I'm reviewing the PDF that you can get on DriveThruRPG. The PDF, like the book, clocks in at 330 pages, and it contains pretty much everything that you would want to see in any type of OSR rulebook. It has instructions for rolling characters, the basics of role-playing, bestiary, a list of magic items and spells. So it really is all a self-contained book, and it works really well that way. If you are familiar at all with the first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook, the moment you open up Chromatic Dungeons, you will feel right at home, because they have emulated the look of the first edition Player's Handbook almost perfectly. The font, the way the tables are laid out, and even the way that the descriptions work all fits right into that first edition ethos. So it's a very good emulation of it. And I did have an opportunity to talk to the creator of Chromatic Dungeons in an OSR group on Facebook. And I asked why they went with this look. And the person replied, because this was where I grew up. So for them, it's an homage to their entry into role-playing games. What makes Chromatic Dungeons unique among OSR games is that it does have an intent behind it. It is designed to be much more inclusive than what you would get in a lot of the old school games back from the 80s or the 90s, and even in some of the OSR games that are released today. So the design team, the artists, and all that goes into it is designed to have a much broader perspective. Going along with that, there are certain changes that are made to the way the game works. There are some things I like about the game, there are certain things I don't like about the game, and there are certain things where I think maybe they missed an opportunity. So let's take a look at that. So one of the first things that's changed in the game is the removal of the word race and replacing it instead with the word ancestry. Now, I've never really had a huge problem with the word race, which comes from Tolkien. That's the way they describe the different races of Middle-earth. And fantasy role-playing games are all pretty much based on Tolkien to some extent. But there's probably a reason why I've never been bothered by the word race in the fantasy role-playing game. I don't know what that could possibly be. What could it be? So for people of color, however, race has kind of been used to keep them down. And so replacing race with ancestry kind of helps them see the positives of the different ancestries that are available in the game without bringing in the baggage of real world realities into their fantasy. So it's a nice way of opening things up for folks, and I appreciate that they did it. Going along with your ancestry is now the concept of heritage. The two blended together are basically what race was in early AD&D and really up into games to this very day. So your heritage is essentially the culture that's attached to your ancestry, and that does give you certain abilities, certain advantages, and certain disadvantages. The way the two things work together is actually pretty good, and I enjoy that. Levels take a cue from 5e in modern gaming, and everyone has a unified level advancement chart. This is something that I don't like to see in an OSR game. I kind of understand why they did it. They're trying to make OSR more accessible to folks who are used to more modern gaming. But there's just something to be said for the fact that a magic user and a fighter and a thief, they don't all advance at the same point. It creates a little more of a dynamic tension inside the group that changes the way you play the game, and I miss it when it's not there. Much as you had in first edition AD&D and second edition AD&D, I never played third or fourth, the different classes are broken up into different groups. So you have the divine character group and the warrior character group and the rogue character group. And these handle the different character classes that are in there. Each group shares a saving throw table, and they have certain abilities that are in common throughout the entire corpus of that particular group. Speaking of saving throws, they have redefined the different saving throws to make a little more sense. You have, instead of death ray, for example, you have reflex, and instead of breath weapon or breath, you have creature ability. These are just ways to simplify the different categories you would use for particular saves. And it simplifies a lot of what was in those old school terminology. People used to ask, for example, why you would use a death ray save or a paralysis save to escape a trap that was about to come down on your head. And here when they're saying it's a reflex save, well, now that just makes sense. I enjoyed what they did. I thought they did a pretty good job with it. And that's probably one of the innovations of the game that I actually really like. The artwork in the game is, for the most part, stunning. There are some pieces of art in here that I would love full color prints on to hang on my wall because they are just simply gorgeous. Also, the artwork was designed by folks who were representing their own culture. You're the people really drawing their own version of what they would look like. By opening up people to represent themselves in this game, we have this wonderful look at these incredible artworks from people's own perspectives of what they should be inside the game. And I appreciate that. I think the artwork is really well done, and there are included in this book some homages to the original first edition AD&D Player's Handbook that I really appreciate. The one thing that I wish was in Chromatic Dungeons that's not in here is all those little cartoons that the first edition Player's Handbook had. Some of them are my absolute favorite drawings for any Dungeons & Dragons game ever. And the fact that the game is trying to emulate the first edition Player's Handbook here really makes their omission apparent. There is one kind of comedic drawing inside the book that I've found, but I would have loved to have seen a little more of that. There's a lot that's done in the game that's done with an ability score check. And for the most part, that really works. And that's the way OSR games do tend to check your abilities. You roll a d20 and you're trying to get under your score. One of the things where I think Chromatic Dungeons makes it confusing is it tries to make bonuses to your ability checks modify your ability scores and not the rolls themselves. There's a reason for this. Because they did it this way, now throughout the book, any advantageous adjustment to your roll is going to be a positive, and anything that's going to be a disadvantage is going to be a negative. However, I just don't think it works all that well. Ability score rolls are a roll under mechanic, and every other mechanic shift changes your dice roll, not what's on your character sheet. So they wanted to keep everything consistent. Good things are positive, bad things are negative. But in doing so, they kind of disrupt the mechanic of the dice roll itself. So that's one part where I just think things got a little more confusing than they needed to be. There are no thieves skills in the way that you would have it in first edition AD&D. So there's no charts with your percentile rolls that you have. Everything is now just an ability score, and you're trying to roll under your ability, and you get a bonus to your roll. I do like the fact that they've now changed the way thieves skills work to where they are linked to ability scores, and you can change your bonuses according to a certain amount of points that you get every time you up a level. This goes in with the alternative way that thieves skills worked even in old school D&D, where you could assign points to your percentages for your different thieves skills. They've changed the alignment to get away from the concept of good and evil and gone towards law and chaos. And the reason why they do this, they say, is they're not trying to do individual morality, but they're trying to do these more cosmological understandings. I understand what they tried to do. Here's one of the points in the book where I really think they missed the boat. For a couple of reasons. First off, while I understand that the idea of getting rid of these notions of good and evil as just simply being culturally bound is very popular nowadays, I just don't think it works in function. I get the reason why people want to go away from that. The idea that nationalists love that language of good and evil is a really compelling reason to get away from it. But overall, I just don't think it works. Besides, it's very easy to define good and evil inside a game. Good is what promotes life. Evil is what promotes decay and death. That's just one of those things. By taking up law and chaos, there was a couple things that happened. First off, when you read the descriptions of the different alignments inside the book, they're still using the terminology of good and evil for law and chaos. There are terms of good people and evil people. So you haven't gotten away from good and evil there. You're still using the terminology. You might as well just lean into it then. And the other thing is, I find the idea of law or lawful being much more problematic than either good or evil. In our culture in particular, law or something being lawful can be used to do all sorts of horrible, terrible things. And you just go, well, it's lawful, so you can't do anything about it. And that's the kind of mantra for people nowadays. Law is not the same thing as morality. And so I just think they missed the boat here. I would have much rather them either get rid of alignment entirely and have a mechanic where the GM kind of keeps track of where people are in their own relationship to the cosmological order. I kind of like the way of players having to discover if they're good or evil as they continue on through the game, or just gotten rid of law and chaos and gone with good and evil and let people work that out the way that they want. And that's a little bit of a nitpick on the game. I've never been a fan of Moldvay Cook's law, neutrality, chaos alignment system. I find it problematic, and I kind of wish that they hadn't leaned into it for this game. Maybe done something entirely different. If they wanted to get rid of the notions of good and evil as terms, they could have gone more with a Palladium-style alignment where you have descriptive terms instead. I think that might have been a little bit more helpful and enabled them to achieve more of what they were trying to achieve in this game. So that's something that I've been chewing on since I first got the book, and it's one of the ones that doesn't quite sit well with me. As I said, the layout is almost a perfect representation of a first edition player's handbook of AD&D. It reads the same, it looks the same, it feels the same. I can almost feel myself opening the pages and experiencing that same reality. However, I also think that's one of the places where Chromatic Dungeons just missed the boat. I understand the desire for that nostalgic feel. I feel it myself. But there's a reason why layout design has progressed away from what we had in the first edition player's handbook. There were limitations that TSR had that we no longer have. And by locking themselves into representing this more archaic understanding of layout, it makes the book in some ways less accessible. I sometimes had a hard time figuring out where the different headings were because they suddenly became embedded in a paragraph in certain sections. That's something that the first edition player's handbook did, but it was confusing. There's a reason why we got away from it. And by not freeing themselves up to represent these rules in a way that is fresh, in a way that shows the design principles that exist nowadays, in a way that somehow communicates the different cultural understandings of the people who created this game, I think they really missed an opportunity to let Chromatic Dungeons shine. I would love to see a different presentation of this game that does more of what Old School Essentials does and just completely puts a fresh coat of paint on it and makes the game so much more readable. Because there's some good stuff in here, and I would love them to have the best opportunity to make something of this game moving forward. So did Chromatic Dungeons succeed in what they were trying to do? Well, I mean, that's a kind of a subjective question. For me, the fact that they released the game at all is pretty much amazing. The fact that they were able to get artists of different cultural backgrounds, drawing pictures that appeal to them, to show the way they would want themselves portrayed in the game. I think that's important. The fact that the game is trying to make the whole notion of role-playing more accessible to folks who might not have been included before. That's a really important thing. And the fact that they did it is worth a round of applause. I like it. At the same time, there's not a whole lot in here that is unique among the different OSR games that exist. The idea of switching to Ancestry is good. I also like the heritage mechanic to blend both your ancestral background and your cultural background into that notion of what we now call race in the other games. So that's really the one innovation that they have, and I do appreciate that. But at the same time, there's just not enough there to make me want to go out and buy the print copy of this book when I have Old School Essentials sitting right there on the shelf, and they did the fresh coat of paint on the game, and they're continuing to develop it so that I can do things like D20 Thieves skills. As a PDF, I would say this is worth the $10 it costs to pick up. For the artwork alone, it's really worth it. To let the people know that you appreciate what they did or what they have attempted to do, that's also not a bad thing to do. As a game that I would actually play, I would probably cherry pick some elements out of Chromatic Dungeons, maybe that Heritage and Ancestry split that exists here. That could be something that I would take up, but for most of it, I think I'd rather just play basic fantasy RPG or old school essentials. It seems to be a better design overall. So to Roderick Weibel, I really hope I'm pronouncing your name well. I say thank you for taking this opportunity to make something that is more reflective of the entirety of the population that plays role-playing games. It's a worthy contribution to the OSR movement, even if it's not a game that I'm going to be playing myself anytime soon. I think next week I'm going to be reviewing a book by John Peterson called Game Wizards that looks at the early history of TSR and the personalities involved and kind of the rise and the near utter collapse of Dungeons & Dragons back in the early to mid 80s. Until then, everybody, happy playing.